Siodhan díomh agus fáilte go déon cruinniú siodhan údras pólíonnachta. Níl mí de láthar an phobal inniuh ach tá an phobal an teacht imachtaí an lé nó an teanóna mar go bhfuil míid áchréile bio. Go leor le plé againg agus mór imachtaí ag dul haring. Good afternoon. You're very welcome to this meeting of the Policing Authority, which, although not being held in public, with a public attendance, is being live streamed so that it is available to public, including the media. Much to be discussed in the 2 hours that will follow. Welcome, Commissioner, and all of your colleagues. In the first instance, I suppose it is impossible to overlook the events that happened at sea off the southern coast over the last number of days, and the significant achievement that that represents in terms of quality policing, effective intelligence, and an outcome that will probably have saved immense damage being caused to people's lives and livelihoods with the confiscation of such a high volume of illicit drugs. And perhaps you might want to say something in relation to that operation in as much as you can.
Well, if follow on from the comments of Assistant Commissioner Kelly yesterday, obviously a very complex operation, and there was many threads to it, both in terms of the initial intelligence, the identification then of the MV Matthew, further confirmation as much as we could manage in terms of that vessel, and then our suspicions then further corroborated then by more intelligence and then active investigation, both in respect of it and in respect of the trawler which grounded off the coast of Wexford as well. So there are six arrests at this moment in time, and obviously they're being questioned, and we also then are in also gathering evidence, and obviously there's the drugs and there's the movement of the drugs, but there's also other lines of inquiry that wish to follow, and that's in respect of money, huge investment and a huge outlay to engage in the scale of an operation. And so a very significant part of our investigation is exactly how logistics of all of this was managed in terms of both the shipping, the trawler, the individuals as well. So a lot of work left to do, but undoubtedly a very significant capture given the scale of logistical effort and given then the loss in terms of the loss of revenue then to probably a number of transnational organised crime gangs, and there's already been speculation in respect of the scale of the shipment and how it would be subdivided. But these are all areas then that we wish to investigate and understand further before then we report to the DPP and in preparation of recommendation of charges. But it is it's just important to highlight the importance of international relationships, the importance of actually being in the room in some places and being present, the importance therefore then of our own Garda liaison officer network, and the difference that makes in terms of just relationships, shared understanding, and the fast transfer of information, and then the ability to take that information and actually make something of it in terms of assessing what might be ongoing and what then our suspicions are, and investigating those then to the outcome. But I have to pay great credit to our own defence forces, who did a tremendous job in terms of the fast response to interdict this vessel, and then the exceptionally dangerous operation it was then to successfully board it and take seizure of it while securing the evidence and while securing suspects as well. So it was tremendous joint agency work involving the Defence Forces, Revenue and Customs, who have responsibility for drug trafficking, and obviously then ourselves as well. Thank you.
Very good. And a confirmation, if it were needed, of the significant importance of interagency activity and of the international engagement that has been developing apace by the Garda Síochána over recent years, building on previous. Thank you for that, Commissioner. And our commendations and good wishes to all of those who were involved in the preliminary work and in the events of the last number of days. The first item that we're engaging with today in this public session is under the heading Policing Performance and Service Delivery, and Moling Ryan is going to begin on that. Thank you, Moling.
Okay, thank you, Chair. The first area I'm addressing is the area of public order policing, and it's had significant media coverage particularly over the last couple of weeks, and indeed input from various members of the public and indeed from public representatives, notably in terms of how the policing response was managed during the recent regular difficult situation that was confronted in front of the Dáil, but also extending to various other protests. Now, previously, Commissioner, you stated that Garda Síochána attempts to balance that right of protest with ensuring public safety, including the avoidance of violence and destruction of property. But maybe as a starting point, a good question would be, we've spoken before at meetings with the policing authority, we've spoken about in Garda Síochána decision-making model, and in that there's a graduated response depending on the particular circumstances that you face. I think it might be useful maybe to share with the public how this works in a practical sense in situations that you face.
Just before I turn to my colleague Ashley Willison. All right. So just before I turn to my colleague, Assistant Commissioner Willis, in respect of recent protest activity, has to be said the policing of protest activity is often one of the most complex pieces of policing that we have to engage, because there is a right to protest that is enshrined both in our Constitution and within the European Convention, and obviously we respect that. And so even last week we saw elements of protest there which was entirely legitimate. There were groups there who only wanted to convey protest in respect of very legitimate concerns they had. So that had to be facilitated, and on any day we can have protests that were close to the Houses or Oireachtas, and we would facilitate that. The difficulty often that we have is, particularly with protests which give us challenges around their intention, both in terms of what the protest intends to do, often towards disorder or intimidation, is those protests, they don't work in collaboration or cooperation with us. We don't actually have an organiser then that we can deal with in terms of negotiation or an understanding of what would be acceptable, and actually they're trying to confound us constantly in terms of their tactics as well. So what we have to do then is continually then look at the situation in front of us. So what's the information that we have? What's the intelligence that we know, limited as it might be? I know people think that we have this glass wall that we look into in the intentions of these individuals, but they go to great efforts actually to conceal what their intentions are on any given day from us. And so then with the information that we have, plus what we see developing in front of us, then decide what the appropriate response is at any moment in time. And as you say, you've paraphrased what I've said previously, the best public order for policing for us is actually where disorder doesn't break out, where we manage a protest and we don't get to a situation of, in effect, conflict. But at the same time, we have to respect the right to protest, but also then make sure that we protect others from intimidation, violence, the threat of violence. And these are matters then that the commanders on the ground have to keep on running through in terms of what's happening in front of them, what's our response, have they stepped from the position of what could be seen to be legitimate protest into an area of intimidation or obviously breaking the law in some other way. So that's always the balance. And it's particularly difficult balance, as I say, when you're dealing with individuals who are there to confound our work, aren't cooperative. There is no actual pathway of negotiation or consultation with them, and then quite often that engenders just situations of confrontation and abuse. A lot of it directed towards Garda members, but also then towards the wider public, depending on the circumstances that we face.
And taking that particular point, you've had experience over the last few years, particularly of addressing quite a significant number of protests and number of particularly challenging situations. And an interesting question is what is that threshold? You've built up a significant amount of experience. What is that threshold for a protest tipping into unacceptable behaviour, threat, menace, even in the absence of physical violence? What motivates your response? What is the lever? What needs to be done in terms of whether it be the type of language used, the threats that are used, where the threats are being directed to, voicing claims against people, against individuals or groups or Garda members, you've faced particularly significant, challenging situations. And I'm even thinking in terms of when something might escalate into a hate crime and when you feel the necessity to respond. So that tipping point, where do you see it? I know you've spoken about the particular situation, responding a particular situation, but based on the experience you've had over the last while, is there a particular threshold which determines a specific response or a particular change of response?
A practical change of response in respect of the protests against centres for those seeking international protection was a disorder actually in Sandwood Street, Mount Street, and the attacks on individuals who were seeking international protection, but in effect were in a tented area there. So we had disorder there in May, and that changed our approach because in effect then we had to make sure that those individuals could move from the streets into accommodation. And quite often then we were working with partners in terms of moving them from there into temporary accommodation on into more permanent accommodation. And for that to happen, you needed to be able to open up a pipeline of available accommodation. But that became all the more crucial when we actually saw the risk to individuals living on the streets, in effect in tents in Dublin. So that was a tipping point. That violence was a tipping point in terms of our approach. And we had to then just become a good deal more assertive about protecting centres and making sure then that policing operation was in place to give confidence to the individuals who were being moved into there, and initially, in the initial stages certainly, protect those centres. But it has to be said as well, so if you look back to May, those centres have operated successfully, and without all the huge fears that were being stoked up on social media and were very prominent in terms of raising concerns. So by and large, individuals move into these centres and give no issue whatsoever.
Can I take that issue of the balance that you've spoken about before, getting the right balance in terms of the policing of protests? And this was an issue of public discourse arising from the protests in front of the Dáil. And a lot of the discourse took the form of being of a critical nature in relation to the Garda response. Based on that particular one, what you saw the response, the concern is that the perception of and trust of Garda Síochána, the potential to be damaged or the potential to be compromised. The type of lessons that you may have taken from that particular protest and the Garda Síochána response to it. Well,
we have very specific responsibilities, obviously, to protect the houses of the Oireachtas and make sure that our parliamentary democracy in any day can function properly within the houses of the Oireachtas. So, we've listened to the feedback that we've received. Both AC Willis and I have been in meetings. We've received direct feedback on the policing operation that was in place. There's a review has been conducted by the Chief Superintendent and AC Willis, and that's been reported on already. And so for the next likely point of protest, which in and around budget day seems to be the next liable day that we're going to have a big protest, then we'll have adapted then the policing operation on from what we saw on the first opening day. But there's always an element of uncertainty. Like more turned up than we hitherto expected, and the nature of them was very different from previous protests there. And regrettably, legitimate protesters who had no interest in disorder but just wanted to make their own point were caught up in the midst of it as well. And therefore, then we need to be very careful in terms of our response. In the end, we've listened to the feedback, and we will have a somewhat adapted policing response and policing operation on the 10th of October.
Yeah, and that's the final two areas in this particular topic, if I might raise. One, you raised the issue of intelligence. You mentioned it in response to one of the earlier questions. And you mentioned that in certain situations that Garda Síochána are confronted with, that they tend not to be as organised as one might have seen with previous protests, and where one had the possibility of engaging with somebody to try to well, at least influence the response that you might have. Interested in terms of how significant an issue that is for you currently, and secondly, I'm interested in terms of the experience that you would have had. You mentioned it even in terms of maybe learning from the experience of the Dáil protests. Do you have a structure whereby you can review the experiences you've had in various protests and have those inform your response to similar type protests?
If I turn to AC Willis just to talk about the evaluation and debrief process, and then the planning for subsequent operations.
Thanks, Commissioner. So we have undertaken a comprehensive debrief and review of the events that happened on the day of the resumption of the Dáil, and arising from that evaluation and also the engagement that the Commissioner referenced with relevant stakeholders in Leinster House and others, we have a revised plan in development at present in relation to our future plan for Budget Day initially, and then for other protests. And we're adopting our plans constantly. So we've policed 423 protests so far this year in the Dublin area. We've made 43 arrests, 32 of those in the course of protest activity, but the remainder afterwards and subsequent to protest activity, and the Commissioner also referenced Sandwich Street. So some of those arrests took place not spontaneously during that protest, but afterwards. And do you, Assistant Commissioner, in terms of the 423 protests, have you a structured form of reviewing the manner in which policing took place at those protests, and some means of learning the lessons from the individual ones that you feed into subsequent situations you face? Yes, so we undertake debriefs. Many of the protests, I should say, are fully peaceful, and there is no significant disruption. And I suppose the Commissioner also referenced, we're legally bound by our own constitution, by the European human rights, and also the judgments that come from both the European Court of Human Rights and our own courts. So, and those judgments provide for a certain level of disruption, a certain level of aggression, if you like, to be facilitated. So I suppose we're in that fine balancing act. But in relation to the events last week, we have a senior investigating officer appointed to investigate the wider activities that people have concern about. That will be subject to those behaviours will be subject to a comprehensive file to the DPP, and we will be adjusting our plans for future protests, and we do those evaluations after any protest where we have any disruption or any significant lessons to be learned.
That's great. Thank you very much. Can I change to another topic during the time that's available to me? And the second topic is looking at policing for the Dublin Metropolitan region, and this is an area again that has had a huge media comment, and there've been some responses from Garda Síochána which have been noted and which have got significant media coverage as well. But just perhaps as a starting point, interest in terms of the operational data that you've got for Dublin Metropolitan District. What sort of data, or what does the data tell you in terms of crime patterns in the city centre, and whether there have been any notable recent changes in those crime patterns? Have there been dramatic increases in the last period of time, or are they consistent with what you've experienced in more recent years?
Generally, overall, the crime patterns are pretty consistent with what we've seen in previous years. So if you look at assaults, and particularly at Section 3 assaults, we would refer to them as serious assaults causing harm. There is a reduction in assault causing harm in the city in the last 12-month period. So crime in general, with the exception of thefts, has remained pretty stable. But thefts have increased, particularly theft from shop. And I suppose in public order offences, we have seen an increase in the last month. But I suppose I can attribute that increase to actually our level of activity and those higher detections that are being made in that space with public order.
Yeah. So your broad sense then is that there's a pretty consistent pattern over the last number of years. Media coverage would have suggested that there was particular challenges in a number of areas, notably in the context of assaults. You're suggesting that it is actually quite static. Do you think there's any element of underreporting? Do you get any sense of underreporting of that form of crime, let's say assaults?
In relation to assaults, the reporting pattern is quite consistent as well. And I suppose we have a lot of activity in this area. We are out with our high visibility patrols, conducting significant numbers of high visibility patrols and checkpoints. Plenty of opportunity for people to report crime. We opened the Garda station on O'Connell Street. So if we're talking about the city centre, there's lots of opportunity for people to report crime when it occurs. So we don't have any particular sense of under-reporting. And as I say, the levels are just slightly less than what they have been in other years.
And I appreciate there have been certainly spikes. You've mentioned that in terms of thefts and shoplifting, and this seems to be a feature in a lot of British cities as well. And I might have the opportunity to come back to that in a moment. But in terms of you mentioned the issue of the new Garda station in O'Connell Street. Do you get any sense that has had an impact beyond some element of visibility? Have there been is the issue of reporting into it easily? Is there a sense that it's being used by members of the public to report crime incidents within the city? Do you think there has been in your early, I know it's there just a very, very short period of time, but do you think it's had an impact, positive impact?
I think absolutely the reopening of a Garda station on O'Connell Street has had a positive impact, certainly in relation to the accessibility of that location for people. And I suppose it's not just in relation to reporting crime. So we have people call for a myriad of reasons to seek assistance, to seek guidance on different issues that they might have. And there is good footfall into the Garda station in the daytime hours. I suppose we see it diminishing maybe in the late evening. Say, for example, after 10 o'clock at night, the footfall is really low, but we have a presence there until 2 a.m. On a daily basis. So I suppose to answer your question, there has been a positive and very positive feedback from the business community in relation to that presence there, that very visible presence on the street. And obviously we have assistance there for anyone that does become a victim of crime to be able to go there as well.
I think the issue of visibility has come up time and time again. Is it a policing policy now to ensure a greater level of visibility, notably around the city centre area? And if there is, what is the extent of that increasing focus on it?
So the authority would be aware that the Minister for Justice made available an additional 10 million euros in funding at the end of July. So that funding is being utilised predominantly for high visibility patrols in the city centre, but also for a wider response to crime across the whole region, across the whole Dublin Metropolitan region. So in the city centre we have increased high visibility patrols, and then across the whole region we have high impact days of activity where we target particular areas of crime. And I can give you, some examples there. Out in the northern part of the city, out in the Deemore North, an operation on the 11th of September where 18 people arrested and charged with 82 offences, just under €500,000 in cash seized, vehicles, jet skis, and cryptocurrency and watches seized in that operation. So that's an example of some of the output of the additional funding that has been made available.
Do you use available crime data to determine where your particular activity will be focused?
Yes, absolutely. So we're informed by analysis undertaken by our analysis service. So we do temporal analysis, so we know the day of the time, we know the type of crimes, we know where they're happening, and we target our response then in accordance with what the information is showing us. So in the city centre, for example, we're very mindful that displacement might become an issue when we have a high concentration of high visibility in a particular area. So we're very mindful of that and very conscious of that, and particularly on the, in the areas just outside of the city centre, to make sure that what we're doing in one area isn't having a negative impact in another area. So we're very mindful, and we utilise the services of the analysis service to inform that activity.
We've seen that happen, obviously, in drug activity over the years. You did mention the additional resources that you've been assigned by the Minister for Justice. You might share with us how you've deployed those additional resources and what rationale underpin that deployment.
Yeah, so I suppose so we've done a number of things. So as I said, we have our days of high impact activity targeting particular issues in different, and they vary across the city depending on what the location is, from maybe drug-related intimidation, illicit drug use, it could be assaults, it could be thefts of bicycles in another area, and we utilise that information to inform our activity. And then in addition to that, we have deployed the Garda National Public Order Unit since the 1st of September on a daily basis. So heretofore, we would have deployed them on a sort of an intelligence base, predominantly at the weekends, but if we had information that there were going to be protest activity, we obviously could deploy them spontaneously.
And that's exactly the point I was going to say. How flexible are you in terms of that deployment?
Yeah.
You might, the Operation Citizen has got quite a bit of publicity in recent times as well. You might share with us the sort of key objective of Operation Citizen, and perhaps the focus that you're placing on it, and what you anticipate getting from it.
Yeah, so Operation Citizen was established in 2021, in the late part of the year. And the purpose of Operation Citizen was to provide reassurance to the people who live in the city centre, who visit the city centre, who conduct business there, and who have a reason to go there, to provide them with reassurance that it was a safe place to be in and to visit and undertake their activity. We have continued. We did an evaluation of Operation Citizen after a year, and arising from the outputs that were achieved, we made a decision that we would continue to do it, to implement Operation Citizen. So it essentially are dedicated members of An Garda Síochána, high visibility, undertaking foot patrols And then there's an engagement piece with business community and with local communities, and ensuring that, you know, the local business have a dedicated point of contact where if they have an issue, they know exactly who they need to call and who can address that. So far this year, across the Dublin region, we've seized, I know there was a very significant seizure spoken about at the beginning of this meeting, but I suppose it's important to say across the Dublin region, so far, well, up to the end of August, we seized over 43 million euros worth of drugs in the city in particular operations. We also seized cash of over 5 million euro. And I suppose it's important to say that it's a whole of system approach that's required to address the issues that are in the city centre. So we're very pleased to continue to be part of the community safety plan launched in the northeast inner city by Minister McEntee in a couple of weeks ago. So we will continue to work in partnership with other stakeholders and work very closely with Dublin City Council and with others to try and tackle the issues that underpin or that I suppose create the issues that we see manifest themselves on our street.
I think you're quite right. I think the focus there is the correct one. That issue of interagency working is absolutely critical. I don't have much time left, but what I'm conscious of is the issue of the sort of processes that you might engage in terms of particularly dealing with younger people, and the evidence would suggest, and the feedback that we've gotten in various areas would suggest that significant involvement of young people with crime and crime issues and whatever. And just wondering, are there particular strategies or processes or engagements that you're involved in, or that you have involvement with, that seek to address the unique issues associated with living, operating, managing within the inner city environment?
Yes, there are many initiatives and many agencies that we interact with in the city centre in relation to that, trying to break that cycle for young people, that cycle of crime that some people can regrettably become involved in. So we work very closely, as I say, with the Community Safety Partnership, also with the North East Inner City Initiative, which was an initiative arising out of the Mulvey report. So there's significant activity ongoing in relation to those issues in the city centre, but then in the broader city as well. We have various other initiatives with community safety partnerships, and then we obviously have our JLO juvenile liaison officers in every district across the country, in fact, where we work very much with the children involved and with those young people to try and give them a pathway away from crime, and that's a really successful. Our interventions there are really successful. I think something like 80% of those children never come to adverse attention again. So it's really important. It's really important work, and it's really effective work.
Yeah. Other areas could pursue, but I think time has defeated us, Chair. So I'll pass back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just one brief question from me, Commissioner. Is he with us in the context of the? Sorry. Is there a policing view on the suitability of the front of Leinster House, Kildare Street, as a venue for protests, particularly those that could become complicated?
I think the difficulty is just the tightness of the environs there. I walked the ground again just during the week, and you're in a very tight area. It's perhaps not like other maybe European parliaments, which are sitting behind big esplanades. Like, it's right on the street, and it's a very fine building and surroundings. But it does then lend itself, and I think it's the way our democracy wants to work, is that legitimate protests can take place there. Elected representatives do come out and engage them with protesters, etc. And on most occasions, a great number of occasions, it works very well, and it requires actually minimal, or if any, policing involvement. Is actually just the safe passage of traffic and pedestrians, and that's fine. But one of the important parts for us is to make sure that elected representatives and their staff can operate unimpeded between the houses of Oireachtas and other locations nearby, and that does require that they have, pedestrian and vehicular access to Leinster House. So that's an important consideration for ourselves. So it's not to say there shouldn't be protests there. It is a favoured area for protesters, and as I say, the great majority pass off without any incident. It's where those with more malign intent, then that does become a difficult area. It's so tight actually in terms of space, and we'll have to just tactically look at what our response is in terms of where we have fear of what the nature of a protest might be, or information or intelligence as to the actual intent or nature of what an intended protest might be.
Would you welcome, or is there a process where people have to give advance notice of such protests? Would that assist your policing of them?
Well, it might assist us, but I'm not entirely sure that we need to move there as a society. As I say, the great majority who attend to protest there, they have legitimate protest, they have their protest, they may make noise or have placards, but by and large they actually don't create any form of sort of disorder or public order issue. It's often just managing the traffic and pedestrians around them, and that's fine. What we have just to be very conscious of is the protests of last week. That does seem to be a phenomenon which is building. Certainly it's building elsewhere in Europe. We've seen it certainly build here over the last 5 years, and we would be very conscious that we don't actually, overreact, and that means also overreact in terms of what the legislative response or what legislation we use to manage it is properly lies within the realms of manageable public order, and that's how we approach it.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now moving on to Debbie for the next section, which is, thank you, Debbie.
Yeah, it's okay. Good afternoon. I'm going to cover a couple of areas with you. The first is around the operating model and how it's going. The second is on roads policing. So just to start off, the operating model, Commissioner, has been a key plank in the reform and modernisation of An Garda Síochána. There's been a recent review undertaken. Can you tell us about the outcome of that review? Yeah. Okay.
Good afternoon.
Thanks.
So just by way of an update before I get into the review, on August 27th, we had the Clare Tipperary Division undergo full implementation of the op model. So that's all 4 functional areas. So that's the latest in terms of our updates. So at this time, we have 19 divisions with the business function in place, and 7 with the performance assurance in place, and 7 divisions who have fully commenced all 4 areas. We have moved, because of the review, the 3-county review, we looked at 3 divisional structures. And I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Foster in a moment, but those have moved from 3 divisional structures now into 5. So the 5 under the new model in terms of our new structures will be Waterford, Kilkenny, Kildare, Carlow, Laois Offaly, Sligo, Leitrim, and Donegal. So we've really taken the time over the summer to review where we are, and not just now, but in terms of being fit for purpose long-term into the future, to be able to assess whether or not the structures made sense over the course of time. And if you don't mind, I'll turn it over to AC Foster as well to share.
And maybe before you get into the structures and the change in structures, did the review touch on the overall impact to date on the implementation of the ops model? And I know that you have been sort of learning and adapting as you go along, but has that review spoken to the impact that it has had?
I'll turn it over to AC Foster in a moment, but I will say we are doing a more comprehensive benefits realization analysis. So the answer is yes and no. This was a very short review, a quick review that looked at very specific areas. I think what you're asking about is a more comprehensive benefits realization assessment, and that work has been iterative and is ongoing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hazy Foster.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I suppose what has been very telling in this review is that there are certain areas that require the review, and the opportunity to do so came a bit earlier in the year when we paused the operating model, because of really we had serious concerns about resourcing of some of the divisions. So we undertook the review, and we looked at two aspects of it and the impact it was having in divisions that had gone into the operating model. I suppose the first part of the review we looked at was the business service functional area, which in my own region, 4 of the divisions are now in the operating model. That would be Cork City, Limerick, Kerry, and now Clare Tipperary. And I suppose what we found was there was learnings for us in it. It was around, I suppose, the administrative piece and the operational piece, and the knowledge that was held internally by the guards in relation to that and the Garda staff. So there were a number of issues that we felt that should go back to the divisional offices, and they would have been operational pieces like things like preparation for JPCs, parliamentary questions, and an area around general administration. So we sent people in, I suppose, a team to look at them, those 4 areas, and we agreed as part of the review process they should go back to the divisional offices. So the BSFAs, which are generally run by assistant principals, we also found that some of the processes that we had included in, updating people in relation to what I suppose the procedures were not being implemented. We were getting answers back that saying everything is going grand, but when we actually went in and started looking at it, we saw areas that were of concern. Now, I suppose, we started to think, why is this? What has happened? Because you get a process document, but I think probably what we realised from the BSFA point of view was that we didn't really train our APs properly to address what they were being asked to do. We had people come in from outside the organisation straight in as APs, and you're asking them to run an area, and policing is unique, and we're asking them to run an area, so we saw a gap there. So what we've started to do is, I have a couple of people who are very, very good because they've worked inside the organisation under the BSFA, and they started going round to each division individually and going through every single process with them and seeing where they were, giving them guidance, advice. But what we also did is we set up workshops. So they come in now, the APs and the HEOs, and we sit down with them and we go through stuff with them that we all think, do what it says in the tin. But it's not that simple because people don't know the ins and outs of the internal workings of the Garda Síochána. So that has been a huge learning for us. And I suppose in the areas that struggled within the op model, it is the BSFA because of that. It's the operational piece. All information flows in through general administration. There's the operational piece and there's the administrative piece. And it's trying to marry both so that we get the best outcome and the efficiencies as well. And I suppose just on the second piece of that as well is because of staffing issues in that our resources were tight, we also then had to look at how long does each process take. So when we're trying to find savings, and we have to be able to measure some of these things. So we're in the process of doing that now. And we've just finished in relation to our assessment, and I'll come to that about the 3-county model in a second. We started to look at, well, how many staff do we actually need? So we're just finishing that review now because we obviously have to find further efficiencies because of mobility issues, etc., people leaving the organisation, new people coming in. So in relation to that, there has been an impact for us, a key learning for us, and where we need to support our people. I suppose this, sorry.
Impact, and that's really important in terms of that internal learning. What about the communities within your area? What impact do they feel as a consequence of the operating model and the changes that have been made?
Well, the impact hasn't been realised, I suppose, in the communities. The biggest impact in the communities, and we were seeing it, in the media, in the JPCs, about the size of the divisions and people losing their chief superintendents or losing their superintendents. And that became the second part of the review, which was around the size of the divisions, the crime trends, the movement of people from one area to another, the demographics. We started to look all at that. So what we did then was we engaged with mainly our internal people initially around our chiefs and supers, and we did interviews with them to see what they felt was the impact of the operating model. They had in turn engaged with their communities, and their biggest concern was, and I suppose we were all aware of it, is that they felt they were losing a key person, which was their chief superintendent. So we went back and we looked at some of the divisions, mainly the divisions around Dublin, which there had been a huge increase in demographics, movement of people out of the city, and they would have been the Loud Cavan Monaghan, we'll say. We had Carlow, Kildare, Laois, Offaly, and we reduced them down from 3 divisions to 2 because of the information that we actually found as a result of our review of it. So we are now, just to conclude on this piece, we are now in the process of, we're nearly there. We have realigned where we're going next in relation to what division is now moving into the operating model next.
And what's the learning about the biggest benefit to date? And I know it's not a full review, but, you know.
I think the benefit for us is, I do think that the most successful part of us for us so far is the placing of D-supers in each of the divisions and splitting the crime and the community engagement piece. I do think it gives victims very much a focus on the people who are going to deal with their crimes. Okay. And I certainly think my experience of it is that they are getting a better service as a result of having a crime functional area in each of the divisions.
And do you have systems in place to test that within communities?
Well, we can
outside the public attitude survey?
Yeah. Well, I suppose we can look at our KPIs. I mean, we do have a number of KPIs that tell us our detection rates, obviously, is one of them. But we do, people do write in appreciative of the service. And I think especially, and I know we quote them a lot, is the DPSUs, but there are other areas as well. And I think the victim-focused approach of us through the operating model, we were always quite good at it, but there were gaps there. And I do think that we have probably improved too in relation to our relationships with the DPPs. We've built up because they know the people who are sending in investigations files. So to me, the biggest benefit so far is around the split between community engagement and crime.
And how's the divisional policing plans working out, and the link to the main policing plan? You know, is that considered as part of that operating model and the internal processes?
Well, I suppose within all our policing plans there's a victim focus, and when we put operations together, and we do so across the community engagement piece and we do it across the crime piece, that's written into the policing plan, and we can measure the success of it by quarterly. Generally we would measure the success by, but everybody who has a role in the policing plan, it comes through to the divisional PAFs and the regional PAFs. And, you know, it's like you have to say, well, this is what success we've had, and this is how I can evidence it.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. And we'll look forward to hearing now about the bigger impact assessment and the rollout of the new divisions as they work through that process. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I move now on to roads policing and sort of fairly generic questions, Commissioner, on this? And I suppose before I get into the question, I would like to sort of acknowledge that with the increase, particularly in fatalities, the collisions that result in fatalities and serious injuries, it also has a huge impact on the guards who attend those. And just if you can tell us a little bit about the support for those officers that's in place.
Yes, and the figures all are describing, you know, each of these deaths are an awful trauma for the family and the local community, and they are difficult scenes for all the emergency services actually to deal with. But for ourselves, we have very advanced support process in place, and it is in place every time in terms of local employee assistance, and then the assistance then from our own occupational health. And we've all sorts of services available in terms of 24/7 counselling, which is available, and also then specialist counselling if an individual should need that as well. So we put a big emphasis on these traumatic incidents, and also then ongoing welfare support for other individuals who constantly are coming in contact with traumatic incidents. And all of us recognise, and I recognise, the duty on us to make sure we have appropriate support in place for members who are dealing with these most difficult of scenes. And it is a regular feature, regrettably, that members of Garda Síochána deal not only with fatal road traffic collisions, but also other very traumatic and difficult incidents. And so that can have a very corrosive and wearing effect on any individual. And it's incumbent upon us to support them as far as possible. And we do that to the maximum, and we've grown our support for individuals over the last 5 years considerably. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. We spoke as early as the end of June on this in a public session around the fatalities and the impact that it has on families and communities. And as you acknowledged, Commissioner, it is really quite a horrific, and indeed for some of your officers as well. I'd like to touch on the role of the Guards in reducing all of that trauma. You know, what do you see as your role? And we know what sort of statutory role that you have in relation to roads policing and stuff, but how do you think, well, I suppose our question is, what do you plan to do differently that will reduce the fatalities, the collisions, and the impact on families and communities?
Well, just briefly for myself, because AC Hillman and I met with the relevant ministers this week, and to answer actually that very question about what's going to happen into the short, medium and longer term in respect to reduce the number of road deaths. And there is a Vision Zero, and we are committed with other organisations, other stakeholders, principally the RSA, but others, in terms of the delivery of Vision Zero. Obviously, we have an enforcement role, and that's a big part of our role. There's another very important element of this is around education, and we play our part in that, but there's other individuals and stakeholders who have a very important role there between schools and RSA. There's a piece around just road engineering and engineering out, in effect, frequent accident occurrences, and really we need the cooperation of the local councils in respect of that, because often what we find is that where there has been a fatal road traffic collision, in the years preceding that, there's been a regular pattern of quite serious incidents. So there is a learning point in terms of the wider issue around where accidents are happening and preventing them through engineering or redesign of a road or a junction to try and make them safer. But we recognise that enforcement is very important, and that's visible enforcement. I'd point to the fact that the majority of our fleet now is in the Battenberg design, and that was all around visibility. And also then that we still have dedicated roads policing. We have them in every division, and that they have a specific function in respect of that. But also point to the amount of work that members on their normal patrol work engage in as well, particularly in around the detection of drink and drug driving. But if I might turn to Paula, because there was a set of actions in the short to medium term that we wanted to pursue. Paula, if you could set those out, please.
Maybe before, Paula, you speak, I mean, one of the, as you said, Commissioner, one of the biggest impacts you can have is enforcement, actually doing it on the visibility that you might, I know it affects my behaviour and all the rest of it, but and those detections are down, particularly in the lifesaver offences, and that's, that must be concerning. So maybe someone could speak to why that might be happening. You know, is there an issue around recruitment and retention within roads policing? Is there an issue around how roads policing units are being used as well? So if maybe that could be covered as well.
Okay, thank you. Well, roads policing units are all appointed, so the change back to the 2012 roster from the COVID roster doesn't actually impact on the staffing of roads policing units. Those numbers will stay the same. But we did make a choice, I think probably 18 months ago now, in terms of the hours that roads policing units worked. We thought, given that the spread of accidents, particularly the more serious collisions into the early hours of the morning and right through the night actually, and we moved and deployed our roads policing units onto 24/7. But the outturn of that is also then they're on the road when there are far less motorists on the road, and I do think that there's a dip in terms of detections just in respect of the amount of stuff that's happening in front of them. Secondly, I would say, over the time, like more and more people are driving modern cars, all of which have alarms around not wearing your seatbelt, and non-seatbelt use is certainly, I think, reduced as an issue as a consequence just of simple engineering around seatbelt warnings. And then beyond that then, there is a gap, a lacuna in the legislation because people can use their mobile phones attached to their own Bluetooth system, but actually the problem is people driving along with a phone or something else on their, an iPad or whatever on their laptop, watching TikTok or Instagram or whatever it might be. So I think we have to make sure that our legislation is keeping up with driver practice and where we see offences being committed, and making sure that our legislation actually keeps up with the practical behaviours that we're seeing.
Thank you.
Paula.
Yes, and thank you. And perhaps just to add to that as well, I know there has been much coverage about the numbers in roads policing overall, and I think it is important to highlight. Commissioners already referenced some of that as well, that it is a collaborative approach. Road safety, both our regular members and detectives, our drugs teams as well, do detect roads policing offences. So it is a very much, as community safety is everyone's under everyone's role, so is road safety. And while the roads policing is about 5% of our workforce, so the dedicated roads policing, and while the overall number may be down, actually in some of the regions there's more people in roads policing. So if we look at it in a breakdown by region, Eastern region and Northwest region is one of the regions with the highest road deaths. Their numbers in roads policing have decreased. Where we have seen the decrease, it's in the DMR, but the DMR is the only region where road deaths have decreased as well. So I think we need to look at, what's happening on the roads, where the fatalities are happening, which are on the rural roads, the 80 to 100 kilometre an hour roads. 7 out of every 10 collisions happen on those roads. So I do think Southern region has a slight decrease, but overall, our commitment, and there are plans in place, and there are lists available for allocation should additional resourcing come to those regions. But I think it is important to show that commitment. In terms of the plans as well, yes, as the Commissioners outlined, we had meetings with the Minister earlier in the week. In terms of our own plans of enforcement, we have already had 3 out of our 4 slow down days. Our last slow down day, and that's a very specific focus on speeding. We detected 862 people in the one day. We have another one planned for October. Monday, we've Superintendent Murphy and the Roads Policing Bureau has just finalised the plan for its national Tire Awareness Day. So we're going to focus on Monday, and you'll see social media around our guards, both educating and, where appropriate, enforcement around people's tyres. We have multi-agency operations plans between now and mid-October. Mid-October we'll move into the Halloween plan, and we're already starting to plan for the Christmas and New Year. So in terms of that enforcement, there is very much focus on working alongside my regional assistant commissioner colleagues. And then the second part as well is that the Minister provide additional finance for the safety camera vans. So we have additional deployment of those vans. But again, we have looked at that very much on the where the highest number of fatalities are this year. So the focus initially will be on Tipperary, Galway, Mayo, Meath, Westmeath, Kildare, Cavan, Monaghan and Cork County. So that's where we'll be deploying them. And we will be reviewing that monthly as well, should we need to move them to other locations. But in terms, unfortunately, the data this year is indicating that's where the fatalities, highest number of fatalities are happening.
And just a couple of follow-ups on that. In the campaigns you run, whether it's you as a standalone agency or with others, are there regular evaluations or assessments of the success of those?
Yes, well, the campaigns would be very much run by the Road Safety Authority. They would take the lead. We do, of course, we use our own social media channels.
Yeah.
We now have a regular slot on crime call, which will be going out every month. And we, like last year, as we did our own #SlowDown campaign, where we encouraged and had many sports people and people in the public eye asking the message for everyone to slow down, but very much, and that was what was covered. Actually, we were also at a Oireachtas committee yesterday, and that's what was covered, that the RSA have an additional €3 million that they're going to commit to campaigns from now and the end of the year, very much focused on the trends, and they would carry out evaluation of those, yes.
Well, it'd be interesting to see some of that at some stage. Now, but you did mention the use of data and that sort of information-led operations, and we know from other reports that you've provided earlier this year and last year that you've used that approach to do some quite intensive. I suppose the wider question for us is to the extent to which you are content with the nature and the level of data that you have and the capacity that the guards have for the analysis and to support the operations?
Well, certainly we have, I have a roads policing analyst, and then I have a second analyst who can also support roads policing when required. In terms of that, yes, we do. I think there is opportunity to do further analysis, and we have discussed that with the CIO, and I know he's supportive of that as well. But we do use the information that we have. I think I've previously mentioned the monthly meeting, that we have a tasking coordinating meeting, and we do use the analysis is at that meeting. So while we have the very intensive, you talked about intensive operations, Debbie, that's the bank holiday weekends, and yes, we have, those bank holiday weekends, the outcomes of those are we have seen reduced deaths over the bank holiday weekends all year. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that the rest of the periods with the tragedy we are seeing on the roads. August had 26 fatalities in 1 month, that the highest for a long time. But we do at those meetings use analysis, and we also do use that we share data with the RSA, and they carry out research. So equally, we would use a lot of the RSA research as well to inform, and that's what we share with the regional ACs, their chief superintendents who attend on their behalf. So they have access to all that data when they're then going back to develop their local policing plans for the local divisions.
Okay, thank you. And just one quick follow-up on that, maybe to the regional ACs here, commissioners, is in terms of the road policing responsibilities that you have, do you use your the analysts available and the data that you have available in terms of the tasking for road units and other units? Yeah.
Yeah, so absolutely. So Paula's team provide me actually with the analysis data rather than duplicating the same work. So I get that on a weekly basis, and I suppose I'm a little bit different to my other regional colleagues in that I have both a regional unit and then I also have divisional units. So my regional unit, I have a chief superintendent who coordinates the activities then of what the divisional units do, and that's obviously all based on the analysis of where the activity is most likely to occur, and we look at where collisions have occurred, and then obviously working as well with the council on the issues that the Commissioner has referenced there around engineering, maybe that could improve a particular location where collisions are actually happening. But certainly the analysis provides a very good insight into where we need to be concentrating our activity at times and days.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and thank you to the colleagues for that engagement. Next, we're moving to human resource matters, and Valerie is going to begin on this.
Thanks, Chair. Okay, first of all, at the outset, I thought I put it on. Says it's on, yeah? Okay, sorry about that. First of all, I'd like to say in terms of human resource matters, the authority understands fully that rosters is an ongoing industrial relations matter, so therefore it's not appropriate to get into detail on that today. But we're having an ongoing discussion with you all the time, really, and I even know today in every discussion we have, the issue of resourcing comes up. And you know, you have a requirement to strategically deploy your resources in the best way you can to provide service to the community, and also in the interest of the health, etc., of members. So I think that just goes without saying before we carry on. So we're not going to get into that whole discussion today. And just for anybody listening, the authority has no role anyway in the IOR process, and we have no role in setting terms and conditions of employment. So that's not a conversation for here today. Now, just to clarify at the outset, because really we want to look to the future, as you do yourselves, and I think as all your members do too. So the country's had a COVID emergency, and I think across all our frontline services, and in particular in the Garda Síochána, the commitment and dedication of everybody involved has been absolutely astounding. I think in a challenge that was not time limited, was very scary and terrifying for everybody in the early days, and I think probably too exhausting for everybody involved. And that goes for Garda Síochána, it goes for the other frontline services, and still life goes on, and it's people have to pick up and move on across the thing. But I think it's important that we all recognise that. So obviously, when COVID hit everybody very suddenly, you had a normal roster in place. I think some people call it the Westminstown, but I'm just going to call it the normal roster because it's hard to say Westminstown all the time. But you had a normal roster in place, which was the subject of ongoing review and discussion. And things were moving on, and we might come back to that. And obviously when COVID hit, if I'm correct, you brought in a new roster, and now it's the COVID emergency has passed, so it's, in your view, timely to move back to the normal roster. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yes, you're entirely correct. We were on a roster between 2012 and the early part of 2020, and then in March we moved into the COVID roster, and that was to meet the extraordinary demands of, in effect, providing policing support for the country against both the pandemic, but also then the unique demands of that period, and also protecting our workforce as well. But now we wish to move from that COVID roster back to the Westminstown roster. But that's against the backdrop of the Commission on Future Policing and the Policing Service for the Future project, where a new roster was recommended. We attempted through negotiation to achieve a new roster and have been so far unsuccessful. So that in effect is why we're returning to the 2012 Westminstown roster.
So you're returning to the normal roster that was in place pre-COVID, and you'll be returning to whatever discussions, etc., were going on. I don't want to go any further on that sort of piece.
Good rationale for returning.
Yeah, that's my next question. So in terms of the COVID roster, because I understand it incurred terrific costs for the country and for the taxpayer, which was necessary at the time. What are the advantages to move and disadvantages of moving for you in deploying resources and in maintaining visibility and police on the ground for people? What are the advantages to moving back to the normal roster now?
Well, I'm held to account for the effectiveness and efficiency of the organisation. And in part then, I have to listen to feedback And that's feedback from yourselves, but from JPCs and other politicians from the public. And there are areas of real concern in terms of the ongoing use of the COVID roster. One is in respect of visibility, because in effect we're deploying people against a flatline demand curve, and that's not the situation that we're in now. We're in an economy which is open again, vibrant, both during the day and the nighttime economy. And we've just talked there extensively in terms of visibility around in respect of Dublin and the city centre, but that's not unique to Dublin. Every JPC that I would go to would raise the issue of visibility. Beyond that then, service delivery. We have obviously a responsibility to victims and the support that we provide for victims. And although there's huge confidence in Garda Síochána, victim support and the perception that individuals have of our support for them is not as good as it should be. It sits at about 60%, 59% are content with the amount of support provided to them. But that means a huge number, 41%, were not content with the service that we provide to them as a victim. And also then, roads policing we've talked about as well. People are on the wrong shift, in the COVID shift, in terms of providing that sort of high visibility policing deterrence that has been identified through survey work by the RSA as being important. And then there's just the nature of the 4 on, 4 off. It is a tiring shift. 12 hours is a long time to be in work, but even if you think you've got 2 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.s and then 2 night duties, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. and then 4 days off. So if you are seeking contact with a victim or seeking a witness, a long time can disappear really into that night shift and 4 rest days before you can realistically get back to an individual.
So the COVID roster 4 on, 4 off, that's for 12-hour days or 12-hour nights, and the normal roster is 10-hour days.
10-hour days. That has its disadvantages in itself. That was highlighted in a KPMG report of 2019, but a full examination of that report also sets out the problems, the greater problems really with the 12-hour roster, but also sets out other problems that there is with the 2012 roster. And that's why we need to get back into negotiation and with the association.
Can I ask you something? And it's a peculiarly HR type of question, okay? And it's kind of technical in a way, but normally, as I understand it from a HR point of view and from a legal point of view under working time legislation, etc., when people work shifts, annual leave is expressed or holiday leave is expressed as hours rather than days because of this business of days being different lengths. So if you read the working time legislation, it talks about statutory leave, for example, being represented by, I think the figure is 8% of hours. So I won't get into the maths of it, but how does that, what I understand is in both the COVID roster and the normal roster, so this isn't getting into the IR piece, the principle in Garda Síochána is that leave is granted in days. So that ends up with people getting considerably more leave. And I'm not talking about the rest days, because that's like the weekend, considering more leave than, for example, in the health service, where a nurse who might work a 10-hour shift gets 8 hours for a day off. Am I misreading this, and does it have any impact on the number of people available to you?
Well, one doesn't have to go outside the organisation. There's inconsistencies within the organisation, because while some are on 12 hours, some of the national units remain on 10-hour shifts, and then there are other individuals doing 8-hour shifts. And so there can be a variation actually in the hours you have off as much as 50% between those on an 8-hour shift and those on a 12-hour shift. And because so many are on 12-hour shift, that mounts up to really big numbers.
So what would be, let's say in the COVID roster, which is the temporary one, so, you know, that's going to go one way or another in its own direction. But under that COVID roster, how many whole-time equivalents of people would you be losing in a year because of that particular arrangement? Yeah, would it be in tens or would it be?
So we would. Let's see. I'll just get the actual figure here.
We did discuss this earlier in the year.
If we return to the Westminster Town roster, we get approximately 13,000 hours back per week of operational duty. if we went to a system of just counting leave in hours, then that equates to over 1 million hours returned in terms of duty conducted, and that's going to be in the order of some 600 odd members then. So, and I'm being conservative in those figures because there's always variations. But
so the strategic issue here is that because of the way leave is calculated, you've 600 people not on duty who, if their leave was calculated in the way it is, for example, in other public sector shift areas, they would be at work.
Yeah. So that's a huge loss in itself, coupled with then the amount of money spent, additional money being spent on allowances, because these are expensive rosters to run. And frankly, we have people on at the wrong time in terms of service delivery. And then also overtime is very difficult to control within this roster as well, because so many rest days, and we've such commitment to court witness type duties, etc. There that it's very expensive in terms of overtime. But we started with service delivery, but can't ignore costs because the costs rack up into the tens and tens of millions.
I think it's our job, and in other discussions we have been and we will be addressing the overtime costs and the additional costs incurred. It strikes me that if the holiday leave is being overcounted and some of that is being covered by overtime, there's an immediate opportunity cost of the Garda not being present on duty on the ground, but the real cost then of an overtime premium being paid for that time. I think we probably will leave that there for today, because I'm conscious other discussions are taking place and hopefully that will progress in due course. But I think it is something we will come back to. People are money. A Garda at work is a cost to the taxpayer. And they also need to have, and I know there was a lot of consideration of circadian rhythms, etc., in the normal roster, so that'll all go into your discussion. So I think we leave that there today, but I think it's something that we will come back to. And as I said, it's going across all these rosters, and I appreciate it's going back for quite a number of years as well, so we leave it there. I wanted to move on then, if I could, to the areas of recruitment and retention. I think we're in a full employment economy, so you're competing with recruitment with other organisations and for retention as well. There's been a lot of kind of public discussion on this, but I'd just like to sort of clarify where the situation actually is. On recruitment, is it a question that people don't apply, not enough people are applying, or is it something about the length of the process that you need to go through and that you're losing applicants along the way?
Thank you. If I might turn to Yvonne just to a nice amount of work just in our recruitment processes. I would say that we're in a far happier position than any of their sister police services and in close proximity to us, or indeed in USA or indeed Canada. So at least we're in a far happier position in terms of the interest in joining in Garda Síochána. But if I turn to Yvonne, please.
Well, I suppose the question really is, do you see that there is a problem in recruitment, or how challenging is the recruitment situation for you, both in process and in onboarding?
Thank you for the question. So it is a challenging recruitment market, full stop, within law enforcement. And as the Commissioner has alluded to, I see us in a much better position than international counterparts. However, we can't be remiss. It is a tough time for us for a number of reasons. Number one, yes, a full employment market. Generational shifts in terms of the different types of things that people want to do. The old piece of policing being a job for life. New generation might not necessarily want that. However, we still are attractive, and that has been evidenced by our most recent competitions. And in terms of the Garda trainee competition, we've also just recently launched, which is now closing, our own clerical officer competition. There's been significant numbers have already applied, albeit we just need to close out on overall applicant numbers. So we have been having to do, I would suggest, and the Public Appointment Service on our behalf, who runs the first element of the Garda trainee competition, has had to do a lot more work to attract numbers that we wouldn't have had to have historically. So we have had to focus on much more intensive outreach, which is important not just for numbers, but also for attracting more diverse populations into An Garda Síochána. And also we have been looking at the timeline of our processes. You've referred to that they have, in my view, and as evidence-based, been too long, and at times people will fall out of the process because they may apply, and this is the case now for many, many competitions.
Where are the major delays in that process?
I suppose the delays, there are a number in terms of on the public appointment service. A lot of work has been done by them to reduce the timeline from initial application through to psychometric testing, through to interview. We equally have had delays in our own processes, and it is rightfully so a robust process through from the physical competence assessment, medical, drug testing, and so on and so forth. So the vetting piece for us is also an issue, and as you can rightfully expect, vetting is critical for us to have reassurances about those we employ. And at times, and you would imagine that would be the case now, people will have lived or travelled all over the world, so vetting is more complicated. But that isn't a negative story. I think we've been very successful working with the Public Appointment Service to reduce the timeline. And what we also did was established a Garda trainee steering group within our own organisation, co-chaired by Deputy Commissioner McMahon and myself, to very much so weekly focus on ensuring a timely process. And we soon will be launching, potentially the end of this year, early next year, a further Garda trainee competition. And again, a key focus will be a reduced timeline to try and keep people interested in the process.
When I joined this authority many years ago now, 8 years ago now, with the previous commissioner, previous commissioner, we had a discussion in the early days about why everybody joining the Gardaí as a trainee has to go through the full training, including those who may have served in other jurisdictions, who may well potentially have been given exemptions in some areas. Is that something that should be considered again?
It can be. So, I mean, our approach currently is everyone will come in to Templemore and will attain training there, and then move on in terms of their probation period. You are alluding to, I understand, Valerie, in terms of lateral entry in other jurisdictions or credits for the number of years that you have completed. That is available to us to consider. It hasn't been the focus to the fore. That's not to say it won't be in the future.
Okay, and in attracting people who have experience maybe in other relevant employments, maybe not policing, is there scope to move them up the incremental scale when they start?
That can be.
Okay, that's
that can
there.
Be looked at. And what I
because
would
I mean, not many people might be aware of the Garda scale, the salary scale now is up to close to 60,000 at the max, as I understand it, which isn't unattractive, particularly compared to across the public sector. So I'm putting that out there, but it may take a number of years to get to that because of the nature of incremental scales. So again, I'm thinking of the person who might be a little bit older, bring other experience. When you say you're looking at it, what does that mean?
Well, so in a number of veins, so we have been looking at it with regards to the Garda staff competitions in particular, because that has been a clear barrier, particularly within the legal and occupational health type roles, whereby people will have expertise elsewhere and are on a certain salary elsewhere, very much so having that ability to bring people in on a higher point in the scale. With regards to the sworn side, which you're alluding to, we do have the ability to progress people slightly up the scale if they have certain qualifications. And why I said it is something we can look at, frankly, in terms of our recruitment and retention strategy, we do have a steering group as well with the staff associations and management side. We have agreed that everything will be looked at in terms of what is being done internationally, what's possible for us, and then also focusing on what are the key pieces within the gift of An Garda Síochána to affect, or equally within government.
Okay.
So pay and reward and recognition, as you would expect, are key barriers and at times key motivators in terms of recruitment and retention. So that's why I have answered. And
obviously it's only part of a benefits package. Moving on to retention, First of all, what are the numbers in terms of resignations? I know there's across the Irish public service, because of heavy recruitment in the late 70s, there's a retirement cliff hanging, and it's probably hit you earlier because people retire earlier in Garda Síochána. So let's park retirements for the moment. In terms of resignations, are you seeing, I know the numbers are actually very low, but what's the acceleration like?
Yeah, so I suppose, again, we're seeing less of an issue in comparison to other policing organisations internationally. However, we are seeing a change. So, for example, as of the 31st of August, on the Garda member side, on our sworn side, we saw 219 resignations up until that point with respect to the member side. 219 retirements. And
it's members I'm focusing on now,
219 retirements and 95 resignations. So to be proactive with respect to understanding why people are resigning, we have established our own exit survey. So
what's that telling you?
Well, it's telling us a few things, and I suppose I need to be careful with regards to my response on this, because we have just commenced this and the numbers are small.
The numbers are low, so don't do anything
so
that would identify anybody, obviously.
Of course, the numbers are low. So we've a qualified occupational psychologist who's doing one-to-one interviews, and we soon will be launching an online survey. So there's a whole host of reasons people are telling us. For example, in terms of the challenge of the role now, we all know, and the Commissioner's alluded to it, policing has become much more complex. Also, at times, the change in policing with respect to, rightfully so, accountability, governance, the advance of IT, or things such as just gaining better salary elsewhere.
Is it a push or a pull factor? Are they leaving, or are they joining something more attractive?
It's a bit of both, to be honest, in terms of full employment model or full employment market opportunities available out of the organisation. Also, as I mentioned, not everyone joins to stay forever.
Yeah.
And sometimes people are saying, I want to move on to something different.
In the overall numbers, back to the balancing the scales of recruitment and retention and retirements as well, numbers now compared to the end of last year, are you up or down, and by how many, roughly?
So we are up, just one moment.
Or a period that you may have, just for comparison purposes?
Yeah, so second.
You might want to come back to me, I think, on that one, but and I don't want to ask you to estimate it, but my impression is it's in the very low hundreds.
It is. We're up by a number, not a significant.
Yeah, okay. And you mentioned the number of resignations. One final question on that, if I may. And it's back to this balancing of recruitment and the age and all of that. If a Garda member leaves and resigns, maybe goes on career break first, then resigns, but they're working in another jurisdiction in policing, can they come back? Can they apply again?
So we have the ability to bring people back into the organisation, but it is within a period of time.
Yeah.
And essentially we will look at somewhere in the 5-year period. And also,
and obviously it's based on their experience. And I know in other parts of the public sector, they are giving incremental credit to people who have maintained their profession and maintained their professional registration at home while they're away, because that's evidence of them keeping their skills up. Would you be thinking of looking at a model like that for Garda Síochána? Is unusual in the sense that your professional registration is internal, if you like. So it's a bit difficult to keep a registration going while somebody's away. It's a different way of looking at things. But is there somewhere you could explore in that focus, that steering group that you have? Are you looking at other models of attraction and retention and policing as a professional skill that people might continue and be credited for, rewarded for, be recognised for?
Well, I suppose there's a few things within that. Firstly, in answer to your question, if somebody's wanting to enter back into the organisation, not only the length of time they've been away, but the key skills they've acquired since leaving, and then also the circumstances under which they left would all be factored into that. There is a lot of work being done, as you've rightfully raised, in terms of professionalisation of policing and also the courses and the accreditation that somebody has acquired. We equally have been looking at microcredits within the college, people being able to add courses to gain further qualifications. This then enters into the challenging zone of how pay is awarded in terms of what you already have, and that would need to be very.
And that's
much
something
so
to be
looked at.
explored in another. But it's
Yes.
just in terms of. And is there any move? And I don't know the answer to this. You might know the answer. Is there any move, for example, within the EU to align professional qualifications of policing the way you would have in other professions, or is that?
Well, there is quite a bit of work. I mean, in terms of our work within Garda Síochána, we do work across Europe as well with regards to certain qualifications and accreditations. We do so also within the UK, and also we do so with respect to certain specialist capabilities across Canada and the US. So it will depend really on the training course. But
So
there
is
that
your
ability.
steering group, is that included on that work?
It's not a piece of that
doing?
work, but it is something the head of the college looks at in terms of how we align ourselves in terms of the specialist area and our accreditation.
I'm thinking, and I'll close off
comparison
now, but I am thinking in terms of Ireland, being an attractive place for people to come from other jurisdictions, and they may bring skills and professional experience with them that could be of use. So particularly in our new diverse society, but I don't know if there's an answer to that. It's just exploration is what I was interested
Very
in.
much.
I think we'll leave that on HR for today. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. Commissioner, before we entirely leave that question of rosters, as Valerie said, the authority has no role in relation to industrial relations in particular, or in relation to detailed, to any aspect of the internal management of the organisation or the detailed negotiations of such thing. But we do have a statutory obligation to keep under review the effectiveness of the management of the resources available to the Commissioner, and in particular the deployment of resources to achieve the objectives and to have an efficient and effective policing service delivered to the people. And there's no avoiding the current unhappy differences, to use that legal phrase, between the management and some of the associations in relation to the rosters. And I wonder whether you have something that you could say to us in relation to the way forward and the kind of role that you and your colleagues in the senior leadership have to move the process along, so that that the concern that we might have that the public's confidence in and appreciation of the work of the Garda Síochána could be diminished by the kind of mood and atmosphere that's being reflected in current public discourse at the moment.
And that last point, we are very conscious about that, and we have continually stated about the care that we need to be that needs to be taken in terms of commentary, but also then the further consequences in terms of social media commentary, and a lot of that is actually undoubtedly, I think, undermining confidence in the organisation, just in the nature of it, and that's happened. But in terms of what we're going to do next, we have an industrial relations resolution process. We are at stage 1 of that. A very I think considerable concession was made last week in terms to all the associations in terms of moving back from the WRC, and the option was available to them then to use our internal industrial relations processes. That offer remains open. 3 of the associations are content to engage in that process, and I would just appeal then to the GRA also to engage in those negotiations. We want to move to a better roster. We want to move to a better roster that serves the people of Ireland, but also then gives greater, in effect, time sovereignty to members of Garda Síochána. Like the 2012 roster is off its time, but it does not actually reflect the needs, I think, of a good part of our workforce in terms of their need for variability and flexibility in terms of just their responsibilities outside of work. And we can get to a better place in terms of roster, I think, of collaboration and negotiation with the associations. It is every party has to collaborate and has to work at this jointly for it to be a success. And obviously, any industrial relations process is a voluntary process. And again, I would appeal to the GRA to engage in that process.
Much of the public commentary has been very personal in its character, as if it was a one-person set of decisions as opposed to a senior leadership team. But there is only one commissioner, and I wonder whether... Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry. It's a broadcasting background, don't know how to use a mic. I was saying that much of the public commentary has been very personal in its character, as if all of these decisions were the decisions of one person as opposed to of a senior leadership team within the organisation. But there is only one commissioner, and part of the leadership, the challenge of all leadership, I suppose, is to bring people to unfamiliar destinations, all leadership positions. And I wonder whether there is anything you would want to say now, and I'm not asking you to say anything that would interfere with the prospect of a happier outcome, but is there anything that you can say in terms of what things you might do in your role as Commissioner, in your role as the most senior person in the organisation, that would be more likely to give rise to a happier outcome?
Well, in the end, as Commissioner, I have a responsibility in terms of the leadership of the organisation. But in saying that, the pathway was very clearly laid out for me, both in terms of the Commission of Future Policing and then the Policing Service for the Future in terms of reform of the organisation, but also fundamentally in the Charlton Report and at the tail end of the Charlton Report, the obligations that are placed in this organisation were very clearly set out by Mr. Justice Charlton, and I think that's a reflection actually what the public expect of us, and I think it is written there and it's very manifest that was his expectation of us, and I think that's where we want to be as a police service in terms of being responsive, professional, and seen to be accountable. We do exercise extraordinary responsibilities in society. We have an extraordinary position even in society, but we're also a national police service as well, and we represent Ireland not only here but also abroad. So there are huge responsibilities, not only as me as Commissioner, but everyone in the organisation, and every sworn member took the same oath I did and have the same actually expectations and responsibilities placed on them by the public. So it is for us to collectively, I think, to recognise those, recognise the importance of the service that we provide to the public, recognise the importance of the accountability mechanism, given just how much of the public confidence in Garda Síochána rests on being properly seen to be accountable for the money that we spend and the powers that we exercise. So there's a lot in this role, but there's a lot in the policing role, and I'm very pleased to always note the great successes that we have, but there's always more for us to do. There's always an extra piece in terms of continuous improvement, and in part the roster negotiation is about how we set ourselves up for the rest of this decade in terms of service delivery and how we serve the people of Ireland best, both in terms of policing and national security. And again, I would say we need to get into negotiations as soon as possible.
Thanks, Commissioner. I'm passing over to Elaine Byrne.
Thank you, Commissioner. I just want to return briefly to that last topic on rosters. You've outlined today that the COVID roster costs you 13,000 man-hours a week, which comes to about 600 Gardaí on the street, and at a cost of some tens of million. So they are the human costs and the financial costs of the temporary COVID roster. But what are the top five, in no particular order, implications for the delivery of service, on the quality of service? So what are the cost of that COVID roster on Garda Síochána to do their job and on the public themselves?
Well, I think even if we didn't do anything in the annual leave at all, and went back to the 2012, even if we made no amendment to the annual leave situation, but just went back to the 2012 roster, in effect, we would regain the potential of 320 members actually being in the workplace, and that completely offsets this year's cessations to date. So that's the sort of scale of from what we achieved from the 6th of November going forwards. And where that is important is areas that I've touched upon already, and visibility. Like, you know, we have to decide as an organisation going forward to reset towards visibility. There has been a lot of, in effect, squads and teams set up. They're doing good work, but actually the work that the community expect of us is actually focused on, very firmly focused on visibility. I have to respond to that feedback. So again, a movement then into uniform type work. That's what the public expect of us. They want to see visibility. They're reassured by that, and good police work can come from that as well. The next issue is around service delivery. Again, I've touched upon that. I think that's around the victim support, the engagement with victims, and that's apparent around roads policing in terms of the hours that we're working on, whether they actually fit the demands that are required in roads policing. But we see that in other areas. We've a misfit between the hours that people are actually working and demands are being placed on them, and that's in areas, you know, such as the protective services units at district levels. And there's a variation across the country there, but we have detectives on at the wrong time, because a lot of that detective work involves victim engagement, obviously, but also engagement then with other agencies who aren't on at 1 o'clock in the morning. So there is a piece of just when our members are on duty and available then to the public and other stakeholders. There are issues around costs as well. This is a more expensive roster and provides less service, and those costs are tied up in overtime and the annual leave that we've just talked about, but also in allowances. So like I'm faced with actually, you know, probably two poor options here, and I have to pick between them. And I have to go back then to the only agreed roster, which is the 2012 roster. I can't continue with this roster and really look people in the face and say we're doing well around visibility or we're doing well around victim engagement, when I know actually practically we can't be, given just the work practices that are in place at this time. So it is about the performance and it is about the service delivery. Cost is a factor, because if we weren't spending the money on this, we'd be spending it on something else.
Thank you, Commissioner. So I'm going to have a couple of questions now on suspensions on Garda Síochána. As I understand it, there are currently 112 Garda members and 6 Garda staff suspended from the organisation. Can you tell me about the types of behaviour that might lead to suspension?
John, pass to John.
Yeah, good afternoon. I suppose it's firstly important just to state that the overwhelming majority of members go about their business in a very professional way and don't come under any need for discussion around discipline or their conduct or any requirement to be suspended. And actually, the amount of discipline cases, the amount of complaints is less this year than in previous recent years. And actually, the amount of suspensions is less at this stage of the year. If it remains in this pattern, we will have less this year than the last few years as well. So those are all positives, and most members conduct their duty to a high standard. There's 112 members suspended, like you say. Approximately half of those members are facing criminal prosecution in some regard or another. Some of those relate to perverting the course of justice, which is maybe something that's arisen in the course of their work. Some of it relates to off-duty incidents, maybe suspected of taking drugs or domestic violence issues. A very small number do relate to links to organised crime, and there are a number then for drink driving matters where there are normally aggravating factors And I think that's probably a broad range of the type of reasons why members are suspended. And
Assaults and sexual assaults.
yes, correct, yes. And it's also important to state then that there is a process and a number of considerations that are taken into account before a member is suspended. The current policy sets out a number of primary considerations and a number of secondary considerations, and it's not a decision that's taken lightly, and it is subject to review 4 times a year by myself, and then subsequent discussion with Deputy Coxon, and there is a fairly robust process where the circumstances of each case is kept under regular review.
And what is the process in which the decision is made to suspend an individual? I mean, it has huge reputational consequences, their livelihood and so forth. So, I mean, it's a big decision to make. So what factors come into that decision to suspend a guard from duty?
Yeah, so when a matter comes to light, which may be because a complaint is made or a member is arrested or as a result of a GSOC investigation, the circumstances of that are considered, and the primary and secondary considerations do contain such factors as the impact on public confidence, the strength of the evidence, the likely outcome of the case, and really we are looking at what is the overall damage to public confidence if the member remains on duty. And we also have to consider the likelihood that they could interfere with the ongoing investigation. Was there potential that evidence could be contaminated, etc. But there is a detailed consideration in each case, which involves consultation with the member's local division, and then consideration centrally in headquarters as to the correct course of action to take.
And there's a lot of criticism about the length of time that certain individuals have been suspended for. So can you talk a little bit about why, on occasion, people are suspended for such a lengthy period of time?
So generally then, in almost every case, there will be a criminal justice process or a discipline process, and due process has to be followed. So there will be an investigative stage, often by GSOC, or potentially an internal investigation. That takes a period of time. A prosecution file may have to be constructed for consideration by the DPP. That also takes time. The DPP has to consider the file and make a direction at the end of that. And then there could be a court process. It is correct that some of the suspensions are for lengthy periods. We would like it to be shorter, but there are a number of factors within what I've described that are outside of our control. And sometimes then there will be a disciplinary process to follow any criminal proceedings, and that can also take some time. And the member concerned does have the right to explore legal options, and there are often judicial reviews and appeals within the criminal and discipline process, all of which can take time. And we do look forward to the new bill and new conduct regulations, which we hope will be speedier, and that's in the members' interest and in the public's interest that the cases are resolved quicker.
This is a question for you, Commissioner. How many Gardaí have you recommended to be dismissed during your tenure? And of those recommendations, how many have been dismissed?
Might look to John. Have you got the statistics there, John? I don't want to do it. I don't want to answer
While,
off the
while,
top of my
while John
head.
is looking for that,
Yeah.
I'll just go on to the next question, but I'll come back to that in a moment when you have those precise
Yeah.
figures. I understand why
Yeah.
it's proper to have the precise figure. But what steps are open to you then, Commissioner, in circumstances to ensure that a vulnerable person is not engaging with a person that you have recommended to be dismissed?
Well, that's actually a very live issue because in practice, dismissal is only happening where I have got direct influence in terms of making that decision, and then that decision is ratified at the policing authority. For the last number of years, there's been no dismissal or required to resign decisions have been upheld at appeal, and indeed none of my recommendations as to dismissal or required to resign have been upheld at the appeal process, which is subsequent to my decision. So there is a real issue in respect then of individuals who, in fact, I had lost trust in terms of their ability to deal with vulnerable victims. So that then becomes a problem in terms of that individual continuing to serve. And in effect then, we have to make sure that they're in a position where they have the minimum in terms of freedom of and discretion of movement themselves whilst on duty, and also then subject then to pretty stringent supervision. But in effect, the appeal panel has dealt with them, so often by fine, and then these individuals return to duty. And we have a number of people that, frankly, I'd have a concern about in terms of them remaining members of An Garda Síochána. Have you figures there, John, please?
I don't think we'd have exact figures for that question today, but there's a number of routes from which a member may end up being dismissed. Some of it is through our Board of Inquiry and Appeal Board process, but also then under Section 14 of the Garda Síochána Act and Regulation 39 of the Discipline Regulations. The Commissioner does have summary dismissal powers. You know, it is the case sometimes, as we already said earlier at this meeting, that a member will opt to leave the organisation, you know, as they may be heading down one of those routes. And also then, I think the headline really is, as the Commissioner said, that none of the cases where he has recommended dismissal as an increase in sanction have then the Appeal Board has not held that position.
So as Garda Commissioner, and you've recommended a member to be dismissed, and on a number of occasions your recommendation to the Appeal Board is not upheld, and instead there is a fine, and that member continues to serve. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, that's a risk. It's a risk to the public in the first place. Less important, but there is a reputational risk for us going forward as well. It should be remedied in the new conduct regulations in terms of just how process is followed. And process is always important, but what I think is distinctly lacking in the present regulations is the public confidence and concern for public safety that there should be taken into consideration, and that's very important. We've seen, you know, terrible situations arise in the London Metropolitan Police, elsewhere in the UK, but also in other jurisdictions, where incidents, terrible incidents, and up to including murder, have occurred almost in plain sight. And we never want to be in a position where we have individuals that we have real concerns about, and they are in plain sight and nothing's been done about it. So one has to recognise that members of any police service, members of An Garda Síochána, we do hold extraordinary powers. We do have extraordinary access to people who are vulnerable in society, and it is easy then for those with really malicious and criminal intent to exploit that position. And that's one of the things that I have to guard against, and indeed the whole management team would guard against as well. And we're very, very conscious of that as an organisation. And we are in the process working with the department in terms of new conduct regulations.
So other than waiting for those regulations, are there any other barriers that you could outline to us today that prevents you doing your job when it comes to the regulation and discipline and suspicion of misconduct and corrupt behaviour?
Well, I think overall we've put ourselves in a better place in creating the anti-corruption unit, and that's supplemented then by also very other experienced detectives in MBCI, and we've made it very clear what the organisational expectation is and the standards that we expect of members of An Garda Síochána. That hasn't been popular in every quarter, but so be it. There is a standard to be set, and it's very clear what the public expect of us, and that's the barometer by which this should be judged, because there is peril if we don't follow that through. But just in terms of, I think, our own processes, you know, we learn more with every panel. The learning from that has actually been transcribed, I think, into the new regulations and what they will look like, and also then the experience from other jurisdictions. But I would say I also believe in process. Members also have the right to be heard and the right to defend themselves, and properly then should have process to protect their position and their employment rights. And even as we've outlined, like suspension is last resort. Like suspension is very last resort, and like that is the way it is viewed. Like none of us wish to suspend someone because there's huge reputational damage and also financial impact, and it can be for a long period of time. And all of us are very acutely aware of that as well.
So it's fair to say, based on the recommendations that you have made to various appeal boards of misconduct of Garda members, where you've made recommendations that they be dismissed and none of those decisions have been upheld, that there are Gardaí in the force that you don't have confidence in? Or
yes.
don't, I think you used the word trust.
Yeah, well, I think trust. I think past behaviour is the best predictor of future behaviour, and their past behaviour has been entirely reprehensible.
And if I was a vulnerable member of the public, then how satisfied can I be when I go to the front desk of Garda Síochána that I'm not going to meet one of those individuals that you have recommended to be dismissed?
Well, the earlier answer, and just in terms of how they're stationed, how they're used, how they're supervised, but also then, this also turns on the amount of process we have in terms of dealing with calls, Garda Safe, and into Pulse as well. The thorough records we have then of engagement between members of Garda Síochána and members of the public as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Commissioner.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Commissioner. And I think that brings us right on time to the end of our scheduled meeting today. Sorry, I'm misdirecting myself. There is one final issue that I wanted to raise with you, and that is, and we've already discussed this, you and I, once or twice, and that is the security of data held by the Garda Síochána, particularly in the context of the issues that arose in relation to the Police Service of Northern Ireland and the number of incidents that arose in that jurisdiction. Is there a level of assurance that you can give to the public, to the authority, and to all of the people who work in your own organisation about the safety and security of data that relates to them, and more generally in relation to your regular audits of the security of Pulse data and other data that the organisation holds?
So this has been ongoing area of work, made all the more important after the ransomware attack on the HSE. So we're very aware of our data security, so that external security to make sure our systems can't be hacked into, and that then our data retrieved by some a third party. Internally then, I've set out in a confidential letter to you what the steps are that we take, but in respect of the specific situation, there are very practical steps that we take in terms of freedom of information and subject data requests, in terms of just making sure that only the data requested does leave, and that includes the information that is supplied, for instance, to the Freedom of Information Office in the first place, and what they accept. They only accept data in certain forms to make sure that we don't have, inadvertently, in effect, on a spreadsheet, give out the data behind that. So those processes were in place and, say, well established before the incident in August with the PSNI data, and in effect we are operating under a different set of guidelines and code of practice than the UK jurisdiction as well. So there's a different expectation on how we will work, and we obviously then work very closely then with those who oversee our data protection regime, and to make sure that we are secure. So as much as we can be, we are certain of the security of our data. AC Roberts John touched upon criminal enterprises trying to get hold of our data through either members of Garda Síochána or indeed members of staff. We're always alive to that as well, and that's what the monitoring's about, to look for unusual activity, but also then to look for specific intelligence, etc., which would indicate that happening as well, and also then just any indication whatsoever that our data may be being maliciously taken from systems. So that's just a constant piece of the ACU work as well. Like one of the anti-corruption unit threats that is dealt with is the trying to extract data illegally from Garda Síochána. So we're very conscious of that as well.
There have been a number of occasions, and we discussed one of them at the public meeting in Drogheda a number of months ago, where information has been inappropriately disclosed from within the organisation to people outside the organisation, not necessarily through inappropriately accessing Pulse, but just through disseminating information to which they had access by virtue simply of being in the Garda Síochána. Is there any easy mechanism to prevent that, apart from the quality of the trust that one can repose in individuals and the nature of the supervision that may obtain in individual work circumstances? But how can you reassure yourself that such incidents don't take place, or at least that they're a matter of the greatest rarity?
Well, trust is implicit in the employment. Supervision is important as well. But the next line of defence that I'd want to comment upon is around the work of the Anti-Corruption Unit, also the work of the National Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and the following through then of intelligence, in particular where we have found information going out to criminal groups that by and large has been the result of either suspicions that other members have reported or intelligence that's come back to us from the criminal fraternity. There's not much honour amongst thieves, and in time, if there is a flow of information to some criminal or criminal network, it will come to our attention and we will deal with it then properly. Unfortunately, we've been in circumstances where we've had a couple of those in recent years, and they have been appropriately investigated and reported to the DPP.
But and finally, on this, circumstances where people seem sometimes not to be able to resist the temptation to demonstrate the fact that they have information, particularly if the person about whom they have the information is known or has a name that rings a bell. Is there any way of being able to guard against the release of that kind of information, or how can you reassure yourself on that?
Well, where we see such sensitive incident, and that goes beyond fame or notoriety, they're into very sensitive reporting of crime, etc. Then those incidents are closed down, and we are very particular then about how they're reported and under what classification they would be reported. So if there's something sensitive, you have to go out of your way to find it, and if you've gone out of your way to find it, there'll be a record of that then. So regularly all sorts of sensitive matters are reported to me. And I may not necessarily know the identities of everyone. So, we are very careful about how matters are reported. I wouldn't get the information, for instance, on who the victims are in certain crime types, sensitive crime types, for instance. And that's right, because if it's not coming to me, then only those who need to know really do know it there. And that's there is a piece about. If you don't need to know this, then don't try and look for it nor find it out. Keep keep yourself to what concerns you and what you need to know. And that's a bit of a culture as well there. If you haven't sought to know it, then you can't be blamed for leaking it.
That's true. Thank you, Commissioner. And unless any of the colleagues have any other questions to raise, thank you, Commissioner, and thank you to all of your colleagues for the open and, as usual, open and frank engagements that we've had today. Our next meeting will be at the end of October in Ballina in County Mayo, where Biden goes, we follow. Thank you very much indeed. The meeting is now over.